I had the bank statements spread across the kitchen table with the spiral ledger open beside them and a calculator between my elbows. I could add the numbers. I just couldn't make them mean anything. The barn had been empty for months. The herd was gone, the milk checks had stopped, and there wasn't much left to sell except the farm itself. My mother had reached the point where she couldn't keep managing the place, and my sister had refused to take it over. That left me sitting at Grandpa's table in May, trying to work out how a failing dairy farm was still receiving money every month. The statements all had the same deposit, $4,200. It showed up once a month under automatic deposits. Same account, same description, although the description didn't tell me much. I checked the dates against the ledger and found the matching entries in Grandpa's handwriting. His writing had gotten worse near the end. The letters leaned into each other, and some of the numbers looked like they'd been written by a person trying to hold a pencil with a pair of pliers. Paid. Every month, the $4,200 had been marked paid. I went through the usual explanations first. There might have been a loan I didn't know about. A piece of land could have been sold years ago, with some kind of payment arrangement attached to it. Maybe there was a rental easement running across the back fields. A hunting lease wasn't impossible either. People paid for access to land around there, especially if they wanted deer and didn't care about walking through mud. None of it matched the amount. None of it appeared in the paperwork I had. I checked the statements again anyway. Then I checked the ledger again, as if Grandpa might have added an explanation while I was looking away. He hadn't. The phone was mounted on the wall beside the kitchen door. I picked it up and called the bank. A woman answered after a few rings. She gave the name of the bank and then identified herself as Catherine. Her voice was careful and a little breathy. She didn't waste words. I told her I was trying to reconcile an old account and asked if she could identify the payer attached to an automatic deposit. She said she could tell me what the account said, but she couldn't guarantee that the account name would explain anything. That wasn't exactly reassuring. I read the deposit number to her, then gave her the date from the statement. She put me on hold for a while. I stood beside the phone and looked out the window at the barn. There wasn't much to look at. The doors were shut. The roof needed work. One of the windows had been boarded up after a storm, and the weeds had grown high around the side where the milk tanks used to be. It was hard to look at the place and imagine someone paying us $4,000, let alone $4,200. Catherine came back on the line. The identifier is Yost Dairy, standing provision since 1955. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope. Who sends the money? She didn't answer right away. It wasn't the normal pause people take when they're checking a screen. I could hear the air coming through the phone and something faint in the background, maybe a printer or a person talking at another desk. Then the silence went on long enough that I looked at the receiver to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Catherine. I'm here. Who sends it? She paused again. Frederick made me promise I wouldn't investigate the account. I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. Grandpa had been dead for several weeks, and I was sitting in his kitchen trying to find out why money was still coming in. Hearing his name from a stranger made the whole thing feel more deliberate. What does that mean? I don't know. You just said you promised not to investigate it. I promised, she said. I didn't ask where it came from. I looked down at the ledger. The word paid sat beside the last 19 entries. I'd been expecting a mistake, or some old farm business that had slipped through the cracks. I wasn't expecting her voice to change when I asked. Did he tell you why? He said the day that deposit stopped, the whole family would stop with it. Then the line went dead. I held the phone for a few seconds. I thought she might have hung up by accident, but Catherine hadn't sounded like someone who made that kind of mistake. I put the receiver back and stood there with the envelope in my hand. The phrase didn't make sense. It was too dramatic for a bank account and too specific to dismiss. Grandpa had never been dramatic about money. He'd complain about feed prices and taxes. He'd argue over a repair bill for half an hour to save $20. He didn't talk like a person who believed the whole family could stop because a deposit stopped. I went into his office. The office was smaller than I remembered, or maybe the furniture had made it seem larger when he was alive. There was a desk under the window, 2 filing cabinets, and a metal shelf holding old farm manuals and tax folders. The air smelled like dust and the oil he used on his boots. I opened every drawer. There were canceled checks, insurance papers, seed invoices, and property tax notices. I found records for the tractor, the barn repairs, and a line of credit that had been paid off years earlier. I found no contract connected to the deposit, no rental agreement, no legal filing, no hunting lease. I went through the filing cabinets and then went through them again. The payment was real. The bank had confirmed it. Grandpa had recorded it every month. But there was no paper behind it, no signature, no account number I recognized, nothing that would let me point at it and say this was the reason. By sundown, I'd stopped looking for a normal explanation. That didn't mean I'd started believing an abnormal one. I just didn't have a better category for it yet. The only thing I found that seemed connected was outside. The box was fastened to a fence post at the north edge of the pasture. I'd seen it before, but I'd never paid attention to it. It was a wooden box about the size of a small toolbox, darkened by weather and bolted to the post with thick metal hardware. The pasture dropped away beyond it toward the peat bog, and the Tionioga River ran somewhere past the wet ground. I checked the property records once more before going out. There was nothing marked at the north fence, no structure, no easement, no notation that explained why somebody had gone to the trouble of bolting a box there. After sundown, I walked across the pasture. The grass was wet against my boots, and the light had gone gray over the river. I kept expecting to find some practical answer waiting for me. A meter, a valve, a place where a tenant could leave paperwork. The box had no lock. I crouched beside it and ran my hand over the lid. The wood was rough and cold. There was a narrow card taped underneath, hidden from anyone looking at the box from the front. I pulled it free. The card came away with a dry ripping sound. I stood at the fence with the card in my hand as the last daylight faded over the bog. The closed wooden box remained bolted to the post beside me. The card stayed on the kitchen counter for almost a month. I moved it a few times when I needed the space, but it always ended up back beside the ledger and the bank statements. It was easier to leave it there than put it somewhere I might forget. The farm didn't change much during those weeks. The herd was still gone. The barn was still empty. The grass kept growing around the fence posts, and the monthly deposit kept appearing in the account like it had no idea anything was wrong. I spent most of that time trying to sell the place. There were calls with an agent in Cortland, a couple of people who wanted to look at the house, and one man who spent 20 minutes asking about the condition of the roof before deciding he didn't want to drive out and see it. I gave them all the same answer. The farm was for sale. The buildings needed work. The land was still usable. I didn't mention the box. It wasn't part of the paperwork, and I didn't know how I'd explain it without sounding like I'd lost my mind. There was a wooden box at the north fence that received a monthly gallon of milk, and if I didn't put the milk there, the family would stop with the deposit. That wasn't something you put in a listing. By the time the next new moon had passed, I'd made up my mind to follow the card once. 1 gallon of milk, one night. If nothing happened, I'd go back to dealing with the farm like a normal person. If the payment stopped, I'd figure out what to do then. The first clear night after the new moon came in June. The day had been warm and damp, but the clouds broke apart before sundown and left the sky pale over the pasture. I drove into Cortland and stopped at Tops on the way back. I stood in front of the milk case longer than I needed to. I checked the labels twice before finding the gallon I wanted. Store-bought raw milk. It cost more than the others, which seemed fair considering how much trouble it was already causing. I carried it out to the truck and set it on the passenger seat. The plastic jug rolled once when I turned onto the road, then settled against the door. The card was clear about the rest. At sundown, fill the box with 1 gallon of raw milk. Never use pasteurized milk. Never use milk from another animal. Close the lid before dark. Don't open the box after dark. If it knocks, Don't answer. If the milk remained at dawn, I was supposed to leave the farm before noon and not come back. I read the card again in the truck. Fill it at sundown. Close the lid. Don't open it after dark. I said the words out loud because hearing them made them sound less ridiculous. It didn't work. I parked near the house and waited until the sun dropped low enough that the pasture had gone gold. Then I took the jug from the truck and walked toward the north fence. The grass brushed against my jeans, and the ground was soft in places from all the rain we'd had earlier in the week. The box looked the same as it had before. Dark wood, thick bolts, no lock. The lid had a shallow dip in the middle where rainwater had collected and dried over the years. I checked my watch. Sundown was close enough. I pulled the lid open. The inside smelled like old wood and damp earth. There was nothing in it. No pipe, no drain, no hidden container. Just the empty bottom, darkened in a few places as if something had been poured there before. I removed the cap from the gallon jug and tipped the milk into the box. It made a soft sound as it spread across the bottom. The white surface looked ordinary. I'd expected something about it to look wrong, but it was just milk. I put the empty jug under my arm and closed the lid. There, I said. That's it. I didn't wait for an answer. I walked back to the farmhouse before the last light went out. The pasture looked different behind me, but that was only because the sun was lower. I left the empty jug beside the kitchen sink. For the rest of the evening, I tried to act like I hadn't done anything unusual. I made coffee. I checked the bank account. I looked over the sale paperwork and answered an email from the agent. The house was quiet enough that every sound seemed separate. The refrigerator turning on, pipes ticking in the wall, a truck passing on the road. I went to bed around 11. At 2 in the morning, 3 slow knocks woke me. I lay still for a few seconds. The room was dark, and I could hear the old fan turning beside the bed. Then the knocks came again. They were coming from outside. I got up and walked into the kitchen. The house felt colder than it should have. June nights could get chilly, but not like that. The air had the dry bite of late fall, and I could feel it against my hands. The empty milk jug was standing on the porch step. The porch was 200 yards from the north fence, across the pasture and up the short set of steps leading to the kitchen door. I looked through the window over the sink. The jug stood upright in the middle of the step. There was still a little milk coating the inside, but the container was otherwise empty. Something pressed down on the porch board. The wood bent under a weight I couldn't see. It creaked once, then held there. The jug trembled but didn't fall. I took a step back from the window. Cold air pushed under the kitchen door. It came in a thin line at first, then spread across the floor around my boots. My breath showed white in front of me. I didn't open the door. A wet line appeared on the outside of it at the height of a tall man's chest. It looked like someone had leaned against the painted wood with a soaked shirt. The mark stayed there for a second, then dragged downward. The line ended near the handle. The knocking stopped at the porch. Then it came from the kitchen door. 3 slow knocks. I stood by the window with my hands at my sides. Opening the door would be worse. "Don't answer," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the kitchen. Nothing knocked again. I kept waiting for it, though. I watched the wet line on the door and tried to decide whether it was moving. Every time I blinked, I thought it had gone lower. The cold stayed until the sky began to lighten. By sunrise, the porch board had stopped creaking. The air warmed in a slow, ordinary way, and my breath disappeared. There was no wet mark on the door. The kitchen floor was dry. I walked across the pasture without taking the jug. It was no longer on the porch. The empty jug stood beside the closed box at the north fence. I opened the lid and found the store-bought milk gone. The drive to the nursing home took less than an hour, but I didn't remember most of it. I kept the card on the passenger seat and looked at it whenever I stopped at a light. The instructions hadn't changed. At least the paper hadn't. The morning was already getting brighter. Trucks were on the road heading toward Cortland, and people were stopping for coffee before work. It was a normal morning for everyone except me. I'd spent the night standing in my kitchen while something knocked on my door, and then I'd found the milk jug beside a box that shouldn't have existed. Silas was the last person in the family who might know what the box was for. He was Grandpa's brother and had worked the farm when the payment first started. I knew he was 91. I knew he lived in the county nursing home. I had no idea whether he was lucid, remembered anything useful, or would tell me to get out as soon as I showed him the card. The front desk pointed me toward his room. The place smelled like disinfectant and cooked vegetables. There were small tables in the hallway with plastic plants on them, and a television playing somewhere behind a set of open doors. Nobody was watching it. Silas was sitting beside the window with a blanket over his legs. He looked smaller than I expected. He was thin beneath his cardigan, with a pale face and two thin hands resting on the chair arms. He turned his head when I came in. "You're the boy from the farm." "I'm Leonard. I know who you are." I stopped near the door. The room had 2 beds, but the one closest to the window was empty. A paper cup sat on the table beside him. He looked at it without touching it. "I brought you something." I took the card from my jacket and held it out. Silas didn't reach for it right away. He stared at the writing from where he sat, and the change in his face was small enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching him. Then he held out his hand. His fingers shook while he read. The card wasn't long. "Fill the box at sundown. Use raw milk. Put the lid on before dark. Don't open it after dark. When it knocks, leave it alone. If the milk is still there at dawn, leave the farm before noon and don't come back." Silas read it twice. "Where'd you get this?" "It was taped under the box." He lowered the card into his lap. "You opened it?" "Yes." "And you put the milk in?" "Yes." "Then you took his place without learning the terms." I didn't answer. He looked back at the card. "You took his farm. That means you took his fence." "I didn't take anything from him. The farm came to me after he died." "That's how taking works when the payer's dead." I pulled the other chair closer and sat down. I'd expected him to deny the whole thing. That would have been easier. If he told me the card was a joke or something Grandpa had written to scare people off, I could have left with an explanation I didn't like but understood. Instead, Silas folded the card along one of its old creases. "What happened in 1955? I asked. He looked toward the window. There wasn't much outside besides a parking lot and a row of bare trees. The trees had leaves when I came in, but from that distance they looked dead. The herd got sick." "What kind of sick?" "A wasting sickness. Cows stopped giving milk, then they stopped eating. You could put feed right in front of them, and they'd just stand there looking at it. A few went down and never got back up." He said it like he was describing a bad season. Maybe after enough years there wasn't much difference. "The farm started failing," he went on. "No milk checks, no money for feed, no money for the vet. Your great-grandfather had the bank calling, and they didn't care what was wrong with the cows. No milk checks, no money for feed, no money for the vet. Your great-grandfather had the bank calling, and the bank didn't care what was wrong with the cows." "Did the sickness spread?" "It was already spread." That didn't answer the question. Silas saw that and didn't seem bothered. "Our father went to the north fence one night. He made a deal there with whatever lived in the north bog." I looked at the card in his lap. "What does that mean?" "It means he went to the fence and asked for help." "From what?" Silas turned his head and looked directly at me. "What lives there?" I didn't like the way he said it. He didn't sound confused or embarrassed. He sounded like I was the one being difficult. "What did it give him?" "The herd recovered. The farm kept going. The payer started sending the check. The bank payment, the milk, the box, the payment, same arrangement." I sat back in the chair. I'd spent a month trying to find a normal reason for the money. A lease, a loan, some old property deal. None of those things had included a box by the fence, but I'd still assumed there was paperwork somewhere. "How much did he promise?" Silas gave me a dry look. "You think the first question is how much? I think I need to know what I agreed to. You agreed when you took the farm. I didn't know there was an agreement. That's the part that gets people killed. He put the card on the table and pressed one finger against the milk instructions. Raw milk, he said, not pasteurized. It wants what's still alive in it. I looked at him. You're saying it can tell the difference? I'm saying it takes what's offered. Don't make the mistake of thinking that means it's stupid. I didn't have an answer for that. The nursing home television changed programs and someone laughed in the hallway. It sounded too loud through the open door. Why the new moon? The first clear night after it. Why does that matter? It can't travel far without moonlight. That was the first thing he'd said that sounded like a rule I could use. I took out my phone and started writing it down. Silas watched me do it. The box stays closed after dark, he said. That keeps it to the box, the fence line, and the dark between them. Open the box after dark and you let it out. Out where? Wherever it can get. That's not an answer. It's the one you get. I wrote down the rest anyway. Keep the box closed. Don't answer the knocking. Leave before noon if the milk is still there. What happens if I answer? It gets in the house. The words were simple. And if I don't answer, it stays outside. Until morning? Until the light takes the dark away. I put the phone down. My hands had started feeling cold, although the room was warm. The wet line still marked the door from the kitchen. I could still hear the 3 knocks. The milk was gone at dawn, I said. Then the payer was satisfied. I'm not a payer. Silas leaned forward in the chair. You are now. He moved quickly for someone his age. His hand closed around my wrist before I could pull away. His grip was thin but hard, and his fingers pressed against the bones. The milk is the interest. 19 years ago it called the principal. I looked at his hand, then at his face. What principal? Your grandfather paid it. How? Ask your mother what happened to Richard. He let go of me. I rubbed my wrist. There were red marks where his fingers had been. Silas settled back into the chair and looked tired for the first time. I fed that box from the time I was 14, he said. 14 years old, carrying a gallon through the pasture in the dark. Every month, every new moon. I did what my father told me. 14 years old, and carrying a gallon through the pasture in the dark, every month, every new moon. I did what my father told me. What did it do to you? It never let me die in peace. He said it without drama. That was probably why I believed him. I stood up and put the card back in my pocket. I wanted to ask about Grandpa, about Richard, and why my mother had never told me, but I also wanted to leave before Silas gave me another answer. Wait, he said. I turned toward him. Don't go back to the farm. I have to get my things. Get them in daylight, leave before noon. I'm not leaving until I know what this is. You know enough to leave. No, I know enough to be angry. Silas looked at me for a long moment. That won't help you. Neither did the milk. I walked out before he could answer. The card pressed against my chest through the jacket pocket as I crossed the hallway. I was angry at Grandpa, at my mother, and at Silas for making the whole thing sound like a job I'd failed to do correctly. I got into the truck and started driving. I didn't turn toward the farm. I turned toward my mother's apartment. The drive to my mother's apartment took about 2 hours, mostly because I didn't go straight there. I stopped for coffee, sat in the truck with the engine running, and read the card again even though I already knew what it said. Then I drove past the farm without turning in. By the time I got to Cortland, the coffee was cold and the afternoon had started to fade. My mother lived in a second-floor apartment above a row of small stores. The stairs smelled like old carpet and somebody's cooking. I knocked twice. She opened the door part way and looked at me through the gap. What happened? I need to talk to you. That's not an answer. No. She held the door for a second longer, then stepped aside. The apartment was warm and dim. A television was playing in the living room with the sound turned low. There were dishes in the sink and a grocery bag on the floor beside the counter. My mother looked like she'd been home all day, which was probably true. I took the bank statement and the index card from my jacket. She watched me carry them to the kitchen table. "What are those?" "The payment records, and the card from the box." Her face changed when she saw the card. Her mouth tightened, and she looked past me toward the living room. I put both things on the table. She didn't sit down. "Frederick used the money however he wanted," she said. "That's not what I'm asking. I don't know anything about that box. You just looked at the card like you knew exactly what it was. I've seen it before. That sounds like knowing something." She folded her arms. My mother did that when she wanted a conversation to end before it had started. She'd done it when I was a kid and had broken something in the house. She'd done it when I asked why Grandpa never came to visit. It usually meant she had an answer but didn't want to be the person who gave it. "The farm was Frederick's problem," she said. "He used the money however he wanted. He made his own decisions. Look, I put the milk in the box last night." She didn't move. "I used raw milk. I closed the lid before dark. Around 2 in the morning, something knocked on the kitchen door." "That doesn't mean anything." "The milk was gone at dawn." She stared at me. "The empty jug was on the porch when I went to bed," I said. "In the morning it was beside the box. The box was still closed." My mother sat down at the table. She looked older than she had when I left that morning, although it had only been a few hours. There were gray hairs at her temples and a tired look around her eyes that I'd always mistaken for annoyance. "What did Silas tell you?" "Enough. That man should have kept his mouth shut. He said it started in 1955. The farm was failing, and somebody went to the north fence." She kept looking at the card. "Frederick used pasteurized milk once," she said. I waited. There wasn't any raw milk. The herd was gone by then, and he couldn't get to town. He thought it wouldn't matter. "What happened?" "The milk was still there in the morning. The television was still on in the other room, but I couldn't make out the program anymore. The card said if the milk was still there at dawn, I had to leave before noon. Frederick didn't. Your grandfather wasn't going to abandon the farm. He was supposed to. He believed leaving would put all of us at risk." "Did it?" She rubbed her thumb against the edge of the table. "He thought the payments were the only thing keeping it from getting worse." "That's not what I asked." "No, it isn't." She looked toward the window. The glass reflected the kitchen back at us, along with a strip of gray sky and the dark outline of a building across the street. "He thought there was still a chance to get Richard back." I knew the name. Richard was my uncle. I'd heard it in pieces over the years, mostly when people were talking about old photographs or family records. She'd kept the details to herself. She'd said he left. Then she'd said he was gone. Those were different words, but they had always been used like they meant the same thing. "Get him back from where?" She pressed her lips together. 19 years ago, she said. "That's what I need you to understand. It was 19 years ago." "It wasn't. It was longer than that." She ignored me. "Richard was 22 in August of 1980. He'd been drinking, but not enough to lose his mind. He found out about the box and decided he could prove it was harmless." "How?" "He walked to the north pasture at night." "Who told him?" "Frederick." She looked down at the card again. "Or maybe Richard overheard him. I don't know. I wasn't standing there when they talked." "What did Richard do?" "He opened the box after dark." I'd expected more. "He was gone before anyone could get to him," she said. "Disappeared how?" "I don't know." "You saw him go out?" "Yes." "And then?" "Then Frederick went after him. I followed. We got to the fence and Richard was gone." "Was there a body?" "No." "Blood?" "No." "Tracks?" She shook her head. "The sheriff called Richard a runaway because there was no body and Frederick refused to explain why he'd gone to the fence in the first place. My mother said the report treated it like a young man had gotten tired of his family and walked away. She said they searched the roads and checked the river. Nobody searched the box." "Frederick knew what happened," she said. "He believed it had taken Richard." "Taken him where?" "I don't know, Leonard. It was the first time she'd used my name. It sounded like a warning. He thought Richard was still alive. She continued. He thought the payments were keeping him alive. Maybe not safe. Maybe not the way we'd understand it. But alive. That's why he kept paying. That's why he kept feeding the box. She said Frederick had carried the milk to the fence every month for 19 years. Every payment from the account was proof to him that Richard hadn't been lost completely. The $4,200 wasn't farm income. It was what came back for the milk, and the milk was what kept the arrangement going. I looked at the statement on the table. The deposits had seemed strange before. Now they looked worse. The deposits were tied to Richard. He treated the money like evidence, I said. He treated it like a reason not to stop. What happened after the 19 years? She looked toward the living room again. Frederick got sick. That's not an answer. It's the one I have. I picked up my phone. My sister's number was already in the contacts. I hadn't called her since the morning I left the nursing home, but I didn't need to explain much before she answered. Leonard, where are you? At home. Why? I talked to Silas, then Mom. There was a pause. What did Mom say? I glanced at the card on the table. The farm has a debt attached to it. If I leave, it might pass to you. Sell it immediately. Ethel. No, don't start explaining. Sell it. It could reach the children. It won't if you sell the farm. That's not certain. Nothing about this is certain. You're the one who went to the box. I didn't know what it was. And now you do. I tried to tell her about Richard. She cut me off before I finished the first sentence. She said the children weren't going to inherit Grandpa's secret, and she wasn't going to let the farm decide what happened to them. Her voice got faster the more I tried to explain. Sell it immediately, she said again. Whatever you have to do. Sell the land. Tear down the house. I don't care. I'm not leaving until I know what happened to Richard. You don't know what you're talking about. I know he went to the box in 1980 and never came back. You know what Mom told you? That's enough for now. No, it isn't. It's an excuse to stay. I'm going back. Leonard, don't... I need to find out if there's still a way to bring him back. She went quiet. I could hear something moving on her end of the call. Don't make this about Richard, she said. It is about Richard. It's about you refusing to let go. Maybe. That's not an answer. No, it's a decision. She told me to stay away from the farm. I told her I wouldn't. She ended the call, and I kept the phone in my hand. When the call ended, I kept hold of the phone for a while. I didn't call Ethel back. It wouldn't have changed anything. She'd made up her mind, and I'd made up mine. The next 30 days went by without anything happening at the fence. I kept checking it anyway. I walked out there most mornings and looked at the box from the pasture side. Then I'd look at it from the river side, as if a different angle might show me something useful. The box stayed closed. The bolts stayed where they were. It sat beside the bog with the Tiunioga River moving behind it, brown water slipping past the trees and carrying branches downstream. The posts themselves were ordinary. They were old and gray and leaning in places. The box was the only part that looked maintained. I checked the ground around it for tracks. I checked the hinges. I checked the space underneath the bottom boards. I didn't find anything. I also spent a lot of time looking for raw milk. The card had said raw milk, and Silas had been clear about the difference. I didn't trust a grocery store label anymore. If the milk had to be unpasteurized, I wanted to know exactly where it came from and who had handled it. That was how I found Mario near Freetown. I called the number from a farm listing and asked if he sold unpasteurized milk. The man on the phone said he did, although he used the word raw instead. He asked how much I needed. 1 gallon. There was a pause. All right, he said. You can come by. I didn't tell him what I intended to do with it. Some explanations only made a person sound worse, and I'd already had enough practice sounding clueless. The drive took about an hour. His farm sat past a line of low hills with a red barn and a white house set back from the road. There were cows in a field behind the barn, but I didn't see many of them up close. Mario met me near a small refrigerated shed wearing a plain hat and dark work clothes. He was a broad man with a quiet way of standing. He looked at my truck, then at me, and waited. "Mario?" "That's right." "I'm Leonard." He nodded. "You called about the milk." "I did." "You asked for unpasteurized milk." He opened the shed and brought out a sealed gallon jug. The plastic was cold in his hand. There was a paper label around the middle with the date and the farm's name printed on it. I studied the label. "It's legal?" I asked. "It's sold as animal feed," he said. "That's what the label says." I nodded. He told me to keep it cold until I needed it. I paid him and put the jug in a cooler in the truck. Mario watched me close the lid. "I won't ask what you intend to do with it," he said. "Good." He gave me a small look that might have been amusement, although I couldn't tell. "All right." I drove home with the milk on the passenger side floor. The cooler tipped once when I took a turn too fast, and I reached over to steady it. After that, I drove slower. I didn't want to ruin the one thing I'd worked a month to get right. The new moon came and went. The first clear night after the new moon fell on a Friday in July. The day had been hot enough to make the house feel stale, but the sky cleared before sundown and the air cooled down over the pasture. Just before dark, I took the jug from the refrigerator and checked the seal again. It was still sealed. It was still cold. Nothing about it looked different from the milk I'd bought before, except that this time I knew where it came from. I put the jug in a canvas bag and headed for the north fence. The light was going flat over the fields. I'd done the walk once already, but it felt longer this time. At the box, I checked my watch. Sundown was close enough. I lifted the lid and looked into the box. The bottom was dry and dark. There were no marks from the first offering. No milk residue, no crack in the wood. Nothing that explained where the gallon had gone. I removed the cap and poured the milk in. It covered the bottom in a white layer. I tilted the jug until every drop came out, then held it upside down for a few seconds. The empty plastic made a soft popping sound as it collapsed in my hand. I put the cap back on and closed the lid. I checked it twice. "Closed," I said. The word sounded stupid out there, but I said it again anyway. "Don't open it after dark. Don't answer the knocking." There was no answer. I carried the empty jug back to the house and left it next to the kitchen sink. Then I locked the door, although I knew a lock wasn't going to matter if the thing outside decided otherwise. I stayed awake all night. Nothing knocked. There was no cold air under the door. The porch stayed empty. Around 3 in the morning, I checked the window and saw only the dark pasture and the reflection of my own face. That bothered me more than the knocking had. I'd expected something to happen. I'd spent the whole night braced for it, and when nothing came, I didn't feel relieved. I felt like I'd missed a step. At dawn, I went back to the fence. The sun was just coming over the trees. The grass soaked through my boots, and the river showed through the bare sections of the pasture fence. The box was where I'd left it. I opened the lid. The milk was still there. It hadn't spilled. It hadn't separated or changed color. It looked as fresh as it had the night before. There was no sour smell, no skin on the surface. I stood there with the lid in my hand. The card had been clear. The instruction was to leave the farm by noon and stay away. I'd read the instruction enough times. Knowing it and seeing the milk sitting there were two different things. "Look," I said to the empty pasture. I did it right. There was something underneath the jug. I saw the edge of it when I leaned closer. A river stone had been placed on top of a small object, holding it against the bottom of the box. I reached in and moved the stone. The object was a metal ring attached to a piece of bone. The ring was dark with rust and covered in a layer of dirt. I wiped it with my thumb and saw the year stamped inside. 1978. There were initials beside it, worn down but still readable. RF. I recognized the ring. The bone took another moment. Richard had worn a class ring from his high school. My mother had mentioned it once when she was sorting through old things, although she hadn't said where it went. I'd been a kid at the time and hadn't paid attention. There were a lot of family details I'd treated like background noise. I picked up the ring. The bone came with it. It was a knuckle, small and corroded at one end with dark material caught in the joint. I dropped it back into the box and stepped away. The lid had fresh marks across it, wet gouges cut through the wood above the card. They hadn't been there the night before. The letters were uneven, as if something had dragged a hard point through the surface. I pulled out my phone and called Silas. He answered after several rings.
What is it?
I'm at the fence.
You should have left.
The milk's still in the box. He didn't say anything. It's still there, I repeated. It didn't spoil. It didn't spill. It's exactly where I put it. Silas breathed into the phone. The sound was thin and rough.
It did that before.
When?
The week before Richard vanished.
I looked back into the box. You knew?
I knew the milk stayed. Your grandfather kept carrying it anyway.
Why didn't you tell me?
You didn't ask the right question.
I asked what happened to Richard.
You asked after the fact.
I picked up the phone and held it closer. There's a ring in here, Richard's class ring. It's attached to a bone. Silas went quiet again. There are words cut into the lid, I said.
Fresh words. What words?
I looked at the wet grooves. The letters had been pressed deep into the wood. Bring the payer. Silas spoke so softly I almost missed it.
It's done taking milk.
What does that mean?
It wants the payer.
I'm the payer.
No, the farm is the payer. You're the man carrying the bill.
Then what does it want? He took a moment before replying. I heard something moving near his phone.
The milk was the interest,
he said.
The principal was Richard.
Richard is dead.
The ring says what it says.
That's not an answer.
It doesn't have to be an answer. It's a warning.
I looked at the bone again. The skin on my arms had tightened, although the sun was warming the pasture. What am I supposed to do?
Leave the farm before noon.
The card said that.
Then follow the card.
It says never come back.
Do that too.
And Richard? Silas didn't speak. Silas.
The payer's being called.
What payer? He ended the call. I lowered the phone and looked at the box. The milk was still sitting at the bottom. The ring rested beside the bone, both of them damp from the cold white surface. Above them, the fresh letters cut through the wood. Silas's silence made me check the phone. The call was still connected. What payer? I asked.
The one who carried the milk.
That's me.
You carried the interest. You haven't paid the principal.
I don't know what that means.
It means the box won't take what you give it anymore.
The words were simple, but I didn't like how they fit together. The milk had been the one part I understood. I could buy it, carry it, pour it in, and close the lid. There were rules for that. The rest of it had been family talk and old warnings. What happens if I leave?
The debt follows the farm.
I can sell the farm.
Then it follows whoever takes it.
I won't sell it to somebody.
You can walk away without selling it. That won't help.
I looked at the box. The fresh words cut across the lid above the ring and bone. What happens if I go? Silas took a moment. Silas.
It passes to Ethel.
She doesn't have the farm.
She has the family.
His voice had gone lower. I could hear the effort in it, like he was trying to push each word through something tight. And her children?
The payer doesn't care which branch of the tree it gets fed from.
I stayed quiet. The pasture was brightening around me. The sun had reached the tops of the trees, and the wet grass was starting to shine. It was hard to listen to a man talk about children while standing in a field that looked this ordinary. I'm not giving it to them, I said.
You don't get to choose what the farm owes.
I can choose what I do.
That's not the same thing.
It is today. Silas started to say something else, but I ended the call. I had no use for another warning. I put the ring and the piece of bone into the empty milk jug and screwed the cap on. The jug still smelled faintly sweet. I carried it back through the pasture and left the box closed behind me. The walk to the farmhouse took a while. I kept looking over my shoulder at the fence and the dark line of the river. The words on the lid were too far away to read now. I could still picture them. Bring the payer. I got to the house a little after 9. There were still a few hours before noon, but I didn't feel like I had the morning to spare. I set the jug on the kitchen counter and went into the office for a jar. The jar came from a cabinet above the sink. It had once held pickles, although the label had been soaked off years ago. I washed it out and dried it with a towel. Then I carried the ring and bone over from the kitchen and tipped them inside. The ring struck the glass with a small, hard sound. I avoided touching the bone again. I wanted the bone separate from Richard's ring, but there wasn't a better place for it. The farm had never been good at keeping things separate. Money went into one account. Milk went into one box. People disappeared and stayed part of the family for decades. Frederick's ledger was still on the desk where I'd left it. I put the jar beside it and opened the book. The entries went back farther than anything I had from the bank. Frederick had written in pencil on most of the pages, using the same narrow handwriting I'd seen on the card. Each month had a payment beside it. $4,200. The amount never changed. After Richard disappeared, the payments continued. I checked the first few months twice. Then I went through the whole year. Frederick hadn't missed one. The next year was the same. Then another. He'd kept paying through bad winters, sickness, repairs, and whatever else had happened on the farm. The entries became shorter over time, but they never stopped. There were no notes about Richard, no explanation, just the amount and the date. Frederick had kept the arrangement working. They had kept the farm alive, and whatever waited at the fence satisfied enough to stay where it was. They had also kept Richard from being part of any decision. The word principal was written once near the back of the ledger, underlined so hard the pencil had cut into the paper. Frederick had paid the interest for 19 years and never asked for the principal back. He'd treated the payments as proof that Richard was still there, but he'd never demanded anything beyond that. That meant Richard had been left in the same place all those years. I used my phone to call Ethel. She answered on the 4th ring.
What happened?
I'm at the farm.
I told you to stay away.
I know.
Then why are you there?
I looked at the jar on the desk. The ring was lying on its side against the glass with the bone beneath it. The box stopped taking the milk. There was a pause.
What does that mean?
It wants the payer.
You're not a payer.
That's what Silas said.
Silas says a lot of things.
He said if I leave, it passes to you.
It doesn't pass to me. I'm not taking the farm.
It doesn't need you to take the farm.
Leonard, stop.
The children are part of this.
No.
Ethel.
No. You don't get to drag my children into this because you decided to play farmer with a box.
I didn't decide anything. I inherited it.
And now you can refuse it.
That's what I'm doing. She went quiet for a second.
Sell the place,
she said. I'm not selling it to somebody else.
then burn it down.
That won't fix the fence.
You don't know that.
I know enough.
You keep saying that like it means something.
I rubbed my hand over my face. I was tired, and I'd been awake most of the night. Ethel wanted a clean answer. I understood why she wanted that. I wanted it too. I'm not abandoning Richard, I said.
He's been gone longer than I've been alive.
He's still in the arrangement.
You don't know what that means.
I know what the ring means.
You found a ring in a bone.
I found his ring.
You found something.
It was stamped with his initials.
That doesn't make it him.
No, but it's what we have. She started talking about the children again. She said they hadn't done anything. They knew nothing about the farm, the box, or the payments. She said none of this belonged to them, and she was right. I waited until she stopped. Stay away from the farm, I said. Don't bring the children here. Don't come looking for me.
Leonard, you're not listening.
I am.
You're making this worse.
Maybe.
That's not good enough.
No, it isn't. I looked at the ledger. The pencil marks ran down the page in straight lines. Frederick had done the same thing over and over because he believed continuing was safer than stopping. "I'm going to meet the demand," I said.
What demand?
"The principal." She didn't answer. "I won't leave Richard there forever," I said, "and I won't pass it to you or the children."
You can't promise that.
"I can promise what I do."
You don't know if you'll come back.
"I know." The silence after that was worse than the argument. Ethel told me to call her after the next new moon. I said I would, whether I survived the attempt or not. She started to object, but I ended the call before she could finish. I stayed at the desk for a while. Then I called Silas again. He answered quickly this time.
What did you do?
"I called Ethel."
You told her.
"I told her to stay away."
That won't keep the debt from moving.
"I know." I looked at the jar. "Has it ever returned someone?" Silas didn't speak. "Silas."
Not for Frederick.
"Why not?"
He kept paying.
"The payments were supposed to keep Richard alive."
They kept the arrangement alive. That's different.
Frederick never asked for the principal back?
No,
Then he never demanded Richard.
he was afraid to.
Silas stopped there. "What happens now?"
The box won't take milk anymore. The interest is finished.
"And the principal?"
Once it stops taking milk, it can demand the principal.
There was no milk left to hide behind. That was what Frederick had done, and it hadn't brought Richard back. I picked up the jar and carried it to the desk. The glass was cold against my palm. I set Richard's ring and the bone beside Frederick's ledger and closed the book. Then I decided to meet the demand myself without opening the box. The next month passed with the box closed. I kept the jar beside Frederick's ledger and left the property records open on the desk, although I stopped pretending I was going to find a clean answer in them. The records showed who owned the land. They didn't show what the land owed. I checked the north pasture most days. The marks on the lid stayed there. The box stayed fixed to the post. Nothing else happened, which was almost worse than the knocking. I'd made a decision, and then had to spend 30 days waiting for the night when I could act on it. After the new moon, I bought another gallon of raw milk from Mario. He didn't ask any questions when I picked it up. He just handed me the cold jug and told me not to let it warm up. I put it in the refrigerator when I got home. I also bought a bolt cutter. It was a heavy thing with long red handles. I tested it on an old piece of wire behind the barn, then put it beside the back door where I wouldn't forget it. The box was held to the post with bolts and thick fence hardware. I wasn't sure the cutter would be enough. I didn't have a better plan. That night was clear and cold for the time of year. The grass was wet again, and the river showed as a dark strip beyond the pasture. I carried the milk in one hand and the bolt cutter in the other. I knew the route by then, and I didn't like how familiar it had become. The box was still closed when I got there. I set the gallon beside it. The plastic jug leaned against the post, white and cold in the moonlight. The bolt cutter rested in the grass on my other side. I left the lid alone. I didn't step over the fence. The boundary was hard to see unless I was looking for it. The grass inside the fence had grown taller around the post, but the area beside the box was still flattened in a narrow ring. I stood outside that ring and kept my boots where they were. I looked at the lid. The cut words were darker than the wood around them. "I'm the one Frederick left to pay," I said. "Give the principal back before you take me." My voice sounded normal. That helped for about a second. Nothing moved. The river went on behind the trees. Somewhere near the barn, a piece of loose metal tapped against something in the wind. I waited for the box to answer. The cold arrived without the air changing. It started in my mouth. My teeth hurt first, a sharp pain along the back row that spread through my jaw. I pressed my tongue against them and tasted nothing but the dry, metallic taste that came with pain. Then the cold moved down my throat and into my chest. I'd been cold before. This wasn't that. It felt like something had put a hand inside my face and squeezed. I took half a step back, then stopped myself. The grass at my feet was still standing. The grass around me began to bend. It flattened in a circle. The movement went out from the box in every direction. Wet blades folded down under the pressure. The ring widened until it reached the edge of my boots. I stayed where I was. The pressure increased. My knees started to shake. The bolt cutter lay beside me, but I didn't reach for it. The box gave 3 knocks from inside. They were slow and even. I looked at the lid. It didn't lift. The bolts didn't move. There was no crack between the boards. The sound had come from inside the closed box, just like before. I didn't answer. The pressure pushed harder against my chest. My teeth hurt so badly that my eyes watered. I thought about the card, the old instructions, and every person who had decided that not knowing was safer than asking. I thought about Richard sitting somewhere beyond the box, with Frederick making payments for 19 years and calling that survival. The box knocked 3 more times. I kept the lid closed. I repeated the instructions under my breath. Don't open the lid. Don't answer the knocking. The pressure stayed around me. The grass remained flat. The gallon of milk sat untouched beside the post. I waited through most of the night. The moon moved behind a layer of thin cloud. The cold stayed in my teeth and jaw until the pain became dull enough to ignore. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, but I didn't leave the ring. Every time I looked at the box, the lid was still closed. The knocking came back at intervals. Sometimes there were 3 knocks. Sometimes there was only 1. I didn't keep count. The milk stayed where I'd put it. The box didn't take it. Near morning, the darkness began to thin across the fields. The trees along the river turned from black to gray, and the wet grass picked up a little light. The pressure around me remained. It had stopped feeling like it was pushing and started feeling more like it was waiting. I bent down and picked up the bolt cutter. The handles were cold enough to hurt my palms. I stepped toward the post until I was close enough to reach the lower hardware without crossing the flattened grass. The first bolt held the metal bracket against the wood. I set the jaws around it and squeezed. Nothing happened. I adjusted the cutter and tried again. The handles came together a little farther this time. The bolt made a small cracking sound, but it didn't break. The pressure tightened around my chest. I stopped and looked at the box. "Stay closed," I said. There was no answer. Then the knocking started again. 3 knocks from inside the lid. I put the cutter back on the bolt and squeezed until my arms shook. The metal gave way with a hard snap. One side of the bracket dropped into the grass. The pressure stayed. There were more pieces holding the box to the post. I cut the upper bolt next, then the lower one on the other side. Each cut took several attempts. The handles slipped in my wet hands, and once the jaws caught the edge of the metal and jerked hard enough to pull me forward. I didn't cross the grass. Stay closed. Don't answer. The last piece of hardware was rusted through. I had to work the jaws back and forth before they could bite. My shoulders hurt. My fingers had gone numb. The bolt cutter pulled at my arms. The box knocked again while I was cutting. 3 knocks. I squeezed harder. The metal broke. The box pulled away from the post with a dry wooden crack. I set the bolt cutter down and grabbed both sides. The box pulled hard against my arms. The lid stayed shut. The hinges held. Nothing came through the gaps. I lifted it against my chest. The pressure followed. It moved with me as I stepped away from the post. The flattened grass ended behind my boots, but the ring didn't disappear. It seemed to go wherever I went, pressing the wet pasture down around my legs. The box knocked from inside. I didn't speak. I carried it toward the river. The path sloped down through the north pasture. My boots slipped twice in the mud, and I had to stop once to shift the box against my shoulder. The lid stayed closed each time. The knocking continued at the same steady pace. 3 knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more. The first gray light spread over the trees as I reached the riverbank. The Tiugneoga moved below me, brown water sliding past the stones and carrying small branches downstream. I stood above it with the closed box in my arms. The knocking continued from inside. I let the box go. It hit the river with a heavy splash and went under for a second. Then it came back up farther out, the lid still closed and the wood dark with water. The current caught it and carried it away from the fence line, turning it slowly as it moved toward the deeper part of the bog. I watched for the lid to open. It didn't. The box bumped against a half-submerged branch, rolled once, and kept going. The river took it under the trees. I could still see one corner of the lid between the reeds, but then that disappeared too. There was no flash of light or sudden sound. Nothing reached out of the water. It was just a wooden box being carried away by a river. The cold stopped. It didn't fade slowly. 1 second it was inside my teeth and chest, pressing against my ribs. The next second I was standing in wet grass with my hands empty and my lungs working again. I bent over and put my palms on my knees. My teeth still hurt, but the pain had already started to ease. I stayed like that for a while. I thought the box might do something when it went into the river. Maybe it would come back. Maybe the water would stop. Maybe the thing in the box would decide I'd broken another rule and finish what it had started. Instead, the river kept moving and the sky kept getting lighter. The fence was behind me. The flattened grass ran from the post in a wide circle, pale with frost, and bent down as if something heavy had been standing there. I'd seen the grass move before, but I hadn't seen what it left behind. There was a person lying near the middle of the flattened ring. At first, I thought it was a pile of clothes. The light was still too weak to make out the shape properly, and the man was lying on his side with his knees drawn up. One arm was tucked under him. The other held the milk jug against his chest. I took a step closer. The jug was the one I'd brought from the house. The plastic had been crushed around the middle and the cap was missing. The man's hand was wrapped around it so tightly that his fingers looked white. He was breathing. I could see his back move under the clothes. The movement was shallow, but it was there. I stood over him and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The last time I'd seen a piece of Richard was a ring and a knuckle at the bottom of the box. Now Richard was lying in the grass with the empty jug in his arms. He looked older than the man in the pictures my mother had kept. That wasn't surprising. 19 years had passed. I knew how old he should be, but knowing the number didn't prepare me for his face. His hair was long and matted. It had gone gray in places and stuck to his forehead. His cheeks had sunk in, and his skin looked pale enough to see the blue beneath it. The clothes hanging from him might once have been work clothes, although it was hard to tell what they had been after so long. They were torn and discolored and stiff in places. There was no clear sign of where he'd been. No mud on his hands, no blood, no marks around his throat. Nothing that explained how a man could disappear for that long and come back lying beside a river before dawn. He looked like someone who'd been left outside in bad weather for a long time, except the grass around him was wet and his clothes weren't. I crouched beside him. "Richard?" His eyes opened. They were pale blue. They moved toward me without any other part of him moving. He didn't sit up or pull away. He only looked at me and held onto the jug. I'd never met him before. I'd seen photographs, but they hadn't prepared me for meeting him. In the pictures, he'd been younger than I was now. He had a full face and dark hair and the sort of expression people wore when they thought somebody was wasting their time. My mother had said he was difficult. She'd said he was stubborn and proud. None of that was visible now. The man in front of me was thin enough that I could see the bones in his wrists. "Can you hear me?" He blinked once. I looked past him toward the river. The box was gone. The current had carried it below the trees. Brown water moved around the rocks. "Look," I said. "I'm going to get you out of here." Richard's fingers tightened around the jug. I reached for his shoulder, then stopped before touching him. He flinched anyway. His whole body went rigid, and his eyes moved toward the fence post. He was looking at the place where the box had been. "It's gone," I said. "The box is in the river." That didn't help. His grip tightened again. The plastic crackled under his hand. I didn't call him a spirit or anything else that would make the situation harder to understand. He was alive. He was breathing. He had a pulse when I touched the side of his neck. That was enough for now. I pulled out my phone and called Ethel. She answered quickly. I could hear the change in her voice before she said anything.
What happened?
I found Richard. There was silence on the line.
Leonard, what do you mean?
He's here at the north fence. He's alive. She didn't answer. I checked the phone. The call was still connected. Ethel.
I'm here.
He came back after I put the box in the river.
Where is the box?
It's gone downstream.
You opened it.
No.
You opened the box.
I didn't open it. She started to say something, then stopped. I could hear her breathing through the phone. Richard was still watching me. His eyes stayed fixed on my face, but his body remained tight beneath the torn clothes.
I'm coming there,
she said. Don't bring the children.
I'm not bringing the children.
Stay on the road. I'll take him to the house.
Leonard, is he hurt?
I don't know.
Is he breathing?
Yes.
Then get him inside.
I know.
You don't know anything. You're standing at that fence with...
I said I know. That made her quiet. I looked at Richard again. He still had the milk jug in his hands. The jug had been empty when I took the milk to the river. I'd left it there beside the box. I couldn't tell how Richard had gotten it or why he held it so tightly. Ethel, I said, he can't talk.
What?
He hasn't said anything. He's awake, but he can't talk. She asked me if he knew who I was. He was looking at me, but that didn't mean he understood anything. It could have meant he was afraid.
Call me when you get him inside,
she said. I will.
Leonard.
What?
Don't leave him there.
I'm not leaving him. I hung up and put the phone back in my pocket. The sun hadn't cleared the trees yet, but the pasture was bright enough now to see the open space around the fence post. The box was gone. The hardware lay in the grass. The bolt cutter was farther up the slope where I'd dropped it. I reached for Richard again. His hand stayed locked around the jug. I slid one arm under his shoulders and the other beneath his knees, but before I could lift him, he jerked away from the fence and pressed himself against my legs. He was stronger than he looked. Or maybe fear gave him what strength he had left. It's all right, I said. The words sounded useless as soon as they came out. Nothing about the pasture was all right. I tried to move him carefully. He didn't speak. I tried to move Richard carefully, but he stayed pressed against my legs. His hands were still locked around the empty milk jug. The plastic crackled every time he tightened his grip. It's all right, I said again. I got an arm beneath his shoulders and eased him upright a little at a time. He was light enough that I could lift him, but he fought every movement. Not against me exactly. Against the fence. Against the empty space where the box had been. He kept looking back at the post like it might grow another box if he took his eyes off it. The trip to the house took a long time. I stopped whenever Richard started to stiffen, then waited for him to loosen his grip on the jug. He didn't let go of it. By the time I got him through the kitchen door, my back hurt, and the sun was up over the trees. I called the county home from the kitchen. They told me to bring him in. There were questions I couldn't answer, and then questions they asked again. I told them he was breathing. I told them he couldn't talk. I told them he'd been missing for nearly 2 decades. That last part made the woman on the phone stop for a while. Richard spent the first few days in the hospital. They checked him over. He was badly underweight. He was dehydrated. His blood work was strange, but I never understood the results. There weren't any fresh injuries. No broken bones. No marks that explained where he'd been. He didn't tell them anything. He didn't tell me anything either. The county home had an empty room 2 doors down from Silas. Silas couldn't walk far without getting tired, and Richard couldn't explain where he'd been or what he needed. Putting them in the same hallway seemed practical. Silas didn't say much when I brought Richard in. He looked at him through the open doorway and gripped the arm of his chair. He came back, I said. Silas stared at Richard. Richard stood beside me with the jug held against his chest. His hair was still wet from the shower. The nursing home had given him clean clothes, but he kept pulling at the collar like it was too tight. Silas asked if he'd spoken.
No. He'll speak when he can.
I don't think he can. Silas looked at me then. His face had gotten smaller since I'd last seen him. Everything on him seemed to be sinking inward.
The principal came due, he said.
I know.
You paid it.
I carried the box to the river. That's not what I said. I didn't answer. He'd spent his whole life keeping the important ones out of reach, and now he was too tired to put them back. Richard's room was at the end of the hall. I helped him sit on the bed. He kept the jug in his hands even after I got him under the blanket. Silas watched from his doorway.
The payer is the hand that feeds it, he said.
I'm done feeding it. Silas looked down the hall toward Richard.
Maybe.
He never said maybe when he was certain. The payment stopped after the box went downstream. I checked the account every morning for a while. The $4,200 had arrived every month. Then the next month came and nothing showed up. The month after that was the same. I checked the ledger too. Frederick's narrow pencil marks ended where they had always ended. There was no final note, no explanation. The last payment looked exactly like the first one. The cold never came back to the farm. I kept waiting for it. I stood near the north fence on clear nights and watched my breath disappear in the ordinary air. The grass grew back over the flattened ring. The river stayed where it was. There were no knocks from the post and no new writing on the wood. I sold the dairy before the summer was over. The buyer wanted the barn, the equipment, and most of the pasture. He didn't want the north field. I told him it was fenced off because the ground was bad near the river. The post stayed in place. I had the hole where the box had been capped with concrete, and I left the fence around the pasture standing. There was nothing in there anymore. That didn't mean I wanted somebody's children walking through it. Ethel asked if the farm was worth anything.
Not enough to keep, I said.
That's not what I asked. It needs too much work. She was standing beside her car when I told her. The children were inside with the doors locked, watching something on a phone. Ethel kept looking past me toward the house.
Did you get all the records?
I got what mattered. Did you find anything else? No. She knew I was lying.
Leonard.
It wasn't worth the upkeep.
That's your explanation?
It's the one I have. She looked at the house for another few seconds. Then she told me she didn't want any part of it. I told her she wouldn't have to take any part of it. I didn't tell her about the money. I didn't tell her about the box. I didn't tell her that the arrangement had followed the farm longer than any of us had been alive. Silas died that winter. He'd been sleeping through the night for almost a week before it happened. The nurses said he seemed calmer. He stopped asking what time it was. He stopped waking up and checking the hallway. When I visited him, he stayed in bed and looked out the window. Richard was still 2 doors down. Silas died in his sleep. I sat in the room after the nurse left and looked at his hands. They were folded on top of the blanket. The skin had gone pale and loose. He'd spent 91 years carrying the family's part of the bargain. I didn't know if he'd ever believed it could end. I didn't know if he'd wanted it to. Richard stayed at the county home. He ate when they brought him food. He slept for long stretches. He watched people pass in the hallway. He never spoke about the 19 years, and after a while I stopped asking. There were things I wanted to know. Where he'd been, what he'd seen, whether he'd been aware of Frederick's payments, whether he'd heard me at the fence. I didn't ask. Some questions only give you another thing to carry. I kept his class ring in the ashtray of my truck. The metal had corroded around the edges, but I could still make out the date. 1978. Richard had worn it before he disappeared. I moved away from the farm after the sale. Not far. Far enough that I didn't have to pass the north pasture on the way to town. I still checked the sky after every new moon, though. I told myself I was checking for the cold. That wasn't the whole reason. On another first clear night, I parked outside the county home and turned off the truck. The windows clicked as they cooled. The lot was mostly empty, and the lights over the entrance made the pavement look wet even though it wasn't. Richard was inside. He had his own room now, his own clothes, his own bed. None of that brought back his voice. I opened the ashtray and checked the ring. It was still there. The metal looked worse than it had the last time. A green-gray crust had spread around the inside, and the edge caught on my finger when I picked it up. I turned it over once, then set it back in the tray. The sky was clear above the parking lot. There was no moon to speak of, just the dark spread of it and a few stars showing through. The box had gone downstream. I hadn't destroyed it. I didn't know if it could be destroyed. I closed the ashtray and leaned back in the driver's seat. I watched the clear new moon sky without returning to the farm.